Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week, it may be a familiar face to people who follow the Godcast, is the very Reverend Richard Sewell. Richard is the Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, and Richard has been living in Jerusalem for a number of years now, and we're going to catch up with him and get a real perspective about what life is like living and working in the Holy Land during this difficult time. So, Richard, it's wonderful to welcome you. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. And am I the first guest who's come back for a second visit?
Well, I'm sorry to let you down on this one, Richard. You are the
Uh,
second person.
and who is
Anybody,
who is the first?
the first is Reverend Michael Corran, who
Oh, he's a friend of mine. He's
he's
a
a,
he's a great man.
he's
He's
a
a
lovely
great.
man. He's become a friend of mine. We have got a mutual interest in football. He's a Spurs fan, and I'm a Claret fan, and yeah, so he's been on a couple of times. But
Oh,
so, how
good.
are you, Richard? I mean, you are
Yeah,
living through unprecedented, well, maybe not unprecedented times, but certainly maybe in your lifetime, something that you've never experienced before. How are you?
yeah. Well, there are good days and bad days, and the broad situation is just so utterly awful, and we never really escape it. And I don't entirely want to escape it because it's the lived reality of all the people I live amongst. And I don't want to live in a bubble of the privilege that I've got by being a foreigner here living in a land I love. But I do not feel the impact. I'm privileged by being a foreigner. But the people who work for me, the people who are my clergy colleagues, my brothers and sisters in Christ, my fellow Muslims and Jewish neighbors across this land are suffering terribly. And so I want to participate in that, um, even though I'm not in any way in the firing line. But the pain of these days is just awful. And so, for instance, yesterday my wife came back from the place where she works, which is an institution of the Diocese of Jerusalem, and said that one of her colleagues who used to work with them in Gaza and who then went to work for Médecins Sans Frontières died in a missile attack yesterday. So a bomb from Israel killed him outright. Um, and you bring that back, you can't avoid it. And it's not often that we have somebody directly that we know who died, but we're maybe one further removed from them. But these things impact you and your spiritual welfare, your physical welfare, and emotional welfare. And I think in the last couple of days, actually, I have it has got to me, and I have felt really quite low, and I wouldn't say despairing, but close to it, because the news just gets worse, and every week brings a worse week. Things have not in any way got better. In fact, since October the 7th, I'd say everything has continued just to get worse, and we can't see the end of it. So we're in the midst of it, and worst of all is Gaza. There's a saying here that the answer always to the question, how are you, is Gaza. Now, that could be a bit self-indulgent since we don't live in Gaza, but we're only 45 miles from Gaza. And there have been times when I have traveled out on the weekend to go to get out of Jerusalem, do something different, and I can hear the bombs landing in Gaza. And that's the world we live in. We all live in it, wherever we are in the world. But when you can hear the bombs landing that are killing people, it does something to your heart and your soul that you can't just walk away from and go, well, that was an interesting day. That was a horrible day when it came closer to home than before. So, yeah, the answer to how are you? Yeah, it is Gaza, but it is also trying to do my best to continue to be my little light in my bit of this hell.
Gosh, Richard, that's quite choked me up. Because as you know, I've been out there a few times, and the place gets under your skin quite quickly, doesn't it?
It really does.
And I was just trying to think about that, give that to some perspective to people. Certainly, I would say to any Christians who are listening to that, then please pray for Richard. It's clear he needs our prayers, as everybody there does. But I'm sorry you're finding it tough, but I'm not surprised. I was just trying to contextualize what you were saying about the distance. You know, I live about 40 miles from Manchester, and recently it's been the anniversary of the Manchester Arena bombing, and that really strikes home because it's just around the corner, you know. But you're living through this every day, you know, for weeks and months. What has become hours to weeks to months, and could be inevitably could be years, couldn't it?
Yeah, it
What's
could.
the kind of, you know, when you step out the door, Richard, and you leave the college and have a little wander? What's the feeling in the air? Is there an almost like a tension that, you know, what is it possible to describe that?
It is, but weirdly, in Jerusalem, it's probably better than in many places. Um, Jerusalem has a sort of tension about it that rises and falls, but the overwhelming impression is one of quietness and the absence of people. So today, actually, strangely, my cousin, who's a beloved friend, he's much more than just a family member, he's a friend, and his son are here with me on holiday. So it is actually possible to come to this tragic and hurting land on holiday, but only because they know that I'm here and they've not been able to visit me in the 6 years I've been out here. And they know that they'll be safe with me and that I can guide them. And we've been able to do a few nice things, but the reality has never been very far away. And I've talked about it to them at great length, and they're very interested. And this morning, I was able to arrange a visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. So the famous Dome of the Rock that people will know because it's the iconic image of Jerusalem. And then the other mosque that's on the huge compound that Jews call Temple Mount. And because I've got very close relationships with the people who oversee the security and the welfare of Al-Aqsa, they are able to take me and guests that I have inside the two mosques there. And that's a huge privilege because probably less than 5% of people who visit Jerusalem in the last 20 years have been able to go inside those buildings for complicated reasons. I have never seen Al-Aqsa Mosque so quiet. And that is telling you partly the lack of international pilgrims who are here, those who come as Muslims to visit as pilgrims, but those others who come to visit as people of other religions. So few Muslims were there. It's amazing. And that's because in the conditions of the war, Israel is preventing people under 40 from going to the mosque at all. And so that's a cause of great sadness to Muslims who are not able to go to this beautiful, wonderful, and very important mosque, and difficult that other visitors are not able to attend. So it's quiet. I mean, it's eerily quiet. You can walk through the streets. And, you know, the other day I went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, again with my cousin and his son. And I said, oh, look up there, that's Golgotha. Let's go up to Golgotha, see the place where Jesus was crucified, then back down and around, you know it, round to the other side, around the huge, great dome, under which is the sort of small building which is over the cave where Jesus was buried and resurrected. And I said, this is the cave where Jesus was resurrected. Oh, we can go straight in. There's nobody there. So we literally just walked in, knelt by the place where Jesus was buried, said a prayer, and then walked out. There was nobody else there. It was extraordinary. And that's entirely typical. There are a few people around, but very, very few. And for young Palestinians, whether they're Christians or Muslims, they are keeping a very, very low profile because they are afraid. the Israeli security forces are clamping down on Palestinians so tightly that they just young Palestinians are staying off the streets. So that's also very strange and very unpleasant.
Yeah.
So the fear is around. You see, for me, I don't feel the fear because I'm not in any danger. But for Palestinians around here, they are afraid. And, I would have to say, my predominant perspective is not the Jewish perspective because I live amongst and work amongst Palestinians. So that's my day-to-day reality. But it would be wrong to say that Jewish people don't also feel fear. And in those areas where missiles are coming in regularly from South Lebanon and sirens are going off, every day there, and still around the Gaza border, missiles are coming out. Jewish people are afraid. They live with fear, and that there is that is across all communities, and we identify.
I think I mean, I'm not an expert by any means. I try and educate myself, and like I say, I've been there. But I think one of the great concerns to me is the amount of ignorance around the whole situation. And I think some people assume, Richard, that the whole of Israel supports this. But Israel in many ways is beautifully diverse, isn't it? There are places there that are beautifully diverse and more liberal, more welcoming, more inclusive. What is the feeling amongst Israeli people generally? And also, if you could just say something about whether the Christian community within Israel has a voice to put any pressure on the government to step back.
Yeah, well, the country across the board. So we're always talking about Israel and Palestine. So Palestine being Gaza and the West Bank, and the conditions for Palestinians in those areas is significantly different to how it is in Israel. And then in between the two is East Jerusalem, where I live, which actually should not be considered as part of Israel because it's actually annexed. And so different conditions there. But let's say in Israel, in the first instance, Jews living in Israel proper, there's a diversity of view, but I would say that the significant majority support the war and want it to continue until it is concluded. What concluded means is open to some interpretation. Netanyahu early on and the government said the total destruction of Hamas and the viability of Hamas as an organization, we have to just destroy it. We will not finish till we destroy it. I think it's becoming clear, they should have known it before, but you do not destroy an idea. You can destroy those who are aligned with it in the present time, but there are more who will follow through, particularly if you make heroes of those who died. But there is a significant minority and a growing minority of people who oppose the war and realize that Netanyahu and his far right-wing government, I mean, far right barely does justice to it. It's off the scale in terms of how British people would understand left and right. A growing opposition to the war, partly for the safety of the hostages, because people do not feel that the current strategy of massive attack on civilians and others in Gaza is likely to return hostages home safely. So the families of the hostages are continually protesting against the government, saying you are not paying any attention to the welfare of the precious souls who are currently held hostage in Gaza. And there are others who just oppose Netanyahu and see that everything in his policies and in relation to this war is more about his own welfare and keeping himself out of prison on corruption charges And so that is growing, but it is still, sadly, still a minority.
Richard, can I ask? I'm actually speaking at a grammar school next week, and the kids have submitted questions, and one of the questions that's come up, I'm not asking this so you can answer the question for me, but I'd like to know your view. Is, is this a religious war that we're seeing, or is it something else?
I think it's a war for land that has very significant religious dimensions. But the whole issue arose because of the history of anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe and in North America, that culminated in the Holocaust, that led to an idea, a Zionist idea. I'm not meaning that in any pejorative sense, just the idea that, if you define Zionism, and there are many ways you can define it, but if you define it as the political movement for the establishment of a homeland for Jewish people that happened to end up in the land of Palestine, as it was under British Mandate period in the early part of the 20th century, that the creation of the State of Israel as a result of a Zionist movement to create a homeland for Jewish people created a massive political problem, because in order to create the land of Israel, you dispossessed the indigenous people of the land who were already existing there, the Palestinians. And the removal of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people in the land you might call Palestine, or the land you might call Israel and Palestine, has created a conflict. Many of the Jewish people who moved in were not religious. It was actually, in the first place, much more of a secular left-wing movement, a sort of utopian socialist movement, than a religious enterprise. But Jews, whether they were religious or not, saw the land of Israel, as they understand it, centered on Jerusalem as their historic focus of spiritual focus and maybe geographical focus, was the land they wanted to live in. The fact was, the indigenous people, there were some Jewish indigenous people who lived in the land for generations, but the vast majority of the indigenous people were Christian and Muslim, and they felt dispossessed. So it's a complicated question, but I would say it's predominantly a conflict over land that has very significant and important religious dimensions. But if you had a John Lennon vision of Imagine, no religion, you'd still have a conflict in the land, because it's about so much more than Jews, Muslims, Christians. So it's a complicated answer to a very complicated question, and I could talk about that for hours.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, actually, because I think you've put it very concisely and clearly for people. And if we could just take one step back before we go forward, Richard, just people might have been surprised to hear you say that, Israel is annexed. Can you just say a little about that? Because you can't freely move around Israel, can you? It is in zones, isn't it? Just tell people a little bit about that.
Well, what I said was that East Jerusalem is annexed. So in the 1967 war, there was, say before 1967, the line of demarcation of Israel and what you might call Palestine, or actually it at that time was part of Jordan. They had annexed it. But in the 1967 war, when Arab nations declared war on Israel, and a war then ensued, which Israel decisively won, they not only protected their borders, but they expanded their borders very significantly. And they occupied the whole of the West Bank, which is a large area, maybe 1/3 of the entirety of the land of Israel and Palestine. And eventually, not immediately, but eventually, they annexed East Jerusalem, which is, now a population of probably 300,000 people, and made it almost impossible to see where Israel, Jerusalem ends and East Jerusalem begins. So it became one. And by annexing, that's a status under international law. It means all the instruments of government and municipal control, political control, administrative control come under the occupying force almost without discrimination. So Israel does not have the right to, under international law, Israel disputes this, but under international law, Israel does not have the right to govern East Jerusalem, but in practice it does. So it's an annexation, and it's different from the status of occupation of the West Bank, which is what they do presently in the entirety of the West Bank. So you've got four statuses. The way that Gaza is, which is actually a state of occupation, but the Israelis do not live at all within the boundaries of Gaza. Well, God forbid anybody at the moment struggles to live in Gaza. But then you've got the whole of Israel, which is north, south, and central, in which Palestinians can live as citizens. You've got East Jerusalem, which has a status of annexation, and then you've got the West Bank, which has the status of occupation. And that's, these are complicated things, and people will have got a little bit used to hearing so much of it in the news. Yeah. But there is so much that leaves people confused.
Yeah. And before we this is flying by, and I'm mindful of time, but before we just talk about the Gaza Strip, what are matters like on the West Bank from your understanding, Richard? Is it a bit of a smouldering iron there? What's the feel around the place?
It's in a terrible state, and it's really getting worse by the day. So everything that happens in Gaza has a massive knock-on effect on the self-identification, the emotional and political view of Palestinians throughout this land. But in the West Bank, the impact is most severe, other than Gaza. In the West Bank, it's severe because the actions of the Israeli security forces are getting increasingly violent, increasingly strict and oppressive. They would say because militancy is growing in the West Bank, and that is certainly true. But militancy is growing in the West Bank partly because of the horrors that are taking place in Gaza. And Israel would say, well, the horrors are going on in Gaza because Hamas attacked us on October the 7th. And Hamas and other Palestinians would say, well, Hamas attacked you on October the 7th because of everything that you did to us before October the 7th. So it's a sort of tit for tat. It's more than tit for tat. It's a reaction and a reaction, an action and a reaction, one side to the other, each side blaming the other. But in the West Bank, I've been in there quite a lot in the last few weeks, visiting Church of England bishops to get a view for themselves. So I've heard testimony of what people are experiencing. They're feeling frightened. There is economic hardship of a very, very high order, to the extent that people are even beginning to go hungry because there is so little money, because people have lost their forms of income, partly through the loss of the tourist and pilgrim trade, which many Palestinians in the West Bank were dependent upon, especially the Christian community, but also because many tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank used to work in Israel with permits granted by Israel. Yeah. And the vast majority of those have been withdrawn. And so their form of employment has been lost. So yeah, it's a multiple level of suffering, and it is creating the conditions where actually the support for Hamas is growing. You know, if you cause people to suffer, it drives them further to the extremes. And sadly, that is beginning to happen.
Oh dear. And on the Gaza Strip, Richard, I mean, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? I mean, do we have more an approximation of how many lives have actually been lost on the
Well,
Gaza
we're pushing
Strip?
very near to 40,000 Palestinians, Gazans who have died in the Strip. Goodness knows. I mean, accurate figures are almost impossible to get because the level of destruction is so high, and there are no independent journalists there. So, you know, these are not absolute gold standard facts, but I think it's a pretty fair indication.
And what's your assessment of the end game in this, Richard? Do you think Netanyahu's intentions is to completely flatten the Gaza Strip and then walk away and say, "You should do what you like with it now," or is it something beyond that?
It's the big question. Nobody entirely knows. There is a lot of political pressure on Netanyahu to what they call finish the job, which for some people in the government means erasing the Palestinian population. And if people find that hard to believe, you don't have to search very hard before you will find members of the government who have said explicitly exactly that. Netanyahu will always say, no, that's not the policy. But members of his government have said that and continue to say that to some degree. And there are strong moves amongst some people to repopulate Gaza, but with Israeli people. They want to rebuild settlements in Gaza when eventually they have whatever they think, however they think it can be done, destroyed Hamas. But, you know, we've got this growing problem on the northern border of Israel in Lebanon with Hezbollah, who have been increasingly active, sending missiles into northern Israel, really as a part of the Gaza war, because they're showing solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, actually, I think if Israel stopped their military activities in Gaza today, that immediately the bombings out of southern Lebanon would stop. Israelis would say, well, that doesn't get rid of the threat that we feel and their capacity to do this again. So there are a lot of political pressures now to push Israel to embark upon a massive war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that will be far bloodier and more dangerous, more destructive than what has gone on in Gaza. God save us.
Richard, what a mess. I think, Richard, to finish, I think people get, I hate to say this, but I think people kind of learn to normalize war. We've had what we've seen in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We see it almost on a daily basis, and it almost becomes like, oh, just there's somebody else has died, somebody else has died. But you contacted me a few weeks ago about Leon Nasser, and I think sometimes to personalize somebody's circumstances and situation just makes it a little bit more real. So maybe if we could conclude this chat with just telling us a bit about Leanne and her situation and maybe how people can help.
So Leanne Nasser is an Anglican Christian member of one of our churches in the West Bank, St. Peter's in Birzeit. Her mother, Lulu, is sort of like the church warden of the church. She goes and opens up the church every Sunday night. They only have a Sunday evening service, opens up the church for the priest to come and lead the Eucharist. And her daughter was at university up till a couple of years ago. While she was still a student there, she was out of the blue arrested, supposedly for some sort of political activities. She was taken into administrative detention, which is a form of extreme incarceration where you can imprison people without charge or trial. She was in jail for 3 months. She was, thank God, released and was able to continue her studies, completed, graduated. I went to her graduation party in Ramallah a couple of years ago. And then again, out of the blue, just over 2 months ago, her house was raided. 4 police, actual army vehicles came outside her house. They battered down the door. They terrified the family, held her parents at gunpoint, told them if they said a word, they'd be shot. They made Leanne, 23-year-old young woman, get dressed. They blindfolded, gagged, and handcuffed her, threw her into the back of the vehicle and took her away. They did not explain where they were taking her or why they were taking her. And it took a few days before the family discovered that she was being held in a prison in Israel, so taken out of her homeland, the West Palestine in the West Bank, into a foreign territory. That is actually illegal under international law, to remove people out of their own land into another country. And she has been in administrative detention as she was before, no charge, no trial, in brutal conditions in a prison just outside Haifa in the north of Israel. And the family are desperately worried about her. Insofar as Israel the family know anything about her, they think this is because she is considered to be involved in political activities that Israel would say are of an extreme danger to the people of Israel. I simply don't believe that. She is involved in sort of care and education, and she's a nutritionist. That's what she graduated in. She's empowering people, particularly women, to take control of their lives. She's not involved in political activities that are a danger to the state of Israel. But she can be held indefinitely. So she is initially going to be in for 4 months. She could be released and immediately rearrested under the same system of administrative detention and held for another 4 months. And this could go on indefinitely. There are some people who've been under this same statute for years. And it's a grave injustice. It's not an acceptable way for anybody to be treated. Administrative detention should be kept for people in extreme cases, somebody about to commit a terrorist attack where you might have intelligence about them, but not young people. There are currently 3,500 Palestinians in administrative detention, and 35 of those are under 18 years of age. It's really not an acceptable way for a apparently civilized country to operate. So we are campaigning for Leanne's release. We're praying for her release, and there is a change.org petition calling for her release. On top of that, I would urge people, if you're moved at all by that story, go and look online. You can read a Guardian article about Leanne and her arrest and about her condition, about the bigger issue of administrative detention and its awfulness. And if you go to a hustings in this election time, raise the question of Israel-Palestine and the treatment of people held in administrative detention, and particularly of Leanne. We are so desperate that her situation is not extended further. It's causing such grief to her family and her friends. And it's one case. But as you say, sometimes you need to make it personal to see the real impact in real people's lives, not just a big issue and another 100 people died in Gaza today and another 200 tomorrow. Every single case is a personal case, and it's a cause of great grief. And I just ask people not to look away. Although it's brutal and awful, and they may be fed up to the back teeth of hearing all about these desperate things, but we need the international community not to forget us. We need people to keep raising the questions of what the British government's policy is in relation to Israel and to Palestine, what their strategy is, and will they actually play a positive part, not to send arms to Israel whilst this terrible war is going on, and so many other things that I could say. But it's a plead from the heart that people don't forget the suffering of the people here in this land. It has a lot to do with us. The impact of conflict in the Middle East ripples out to the rest of the world, and Britain is intimately acquainted with it through history and in the present day. And it's not something we can justifiably turn our backs on. And I really appreciate you spending the time and recording this to share with the people who watch your wonderful Godcast, because it's another way of us getting the story out.
Well, folks, you've heard it from the horse's mouth there. You've heard a real honest account of how things are, and I'll put the link to the page for Leanne, so if people want to click on it and find out more, they can. Richard, it's me that has the gratitude. I'm so grateful for you explaining things from your perspective, and I'm also very grateful for you just being there, to be honest. I think your presence is very, very important, and I hope you realise that. I'm sure you do, but I just want to say it to you that it's deeply appreciated. And you know, I get choked up because, like I say, I've been.
Yeah.
People are very special, and it's an incredible, beautiful place. And I just pray that peace falls on everybody there. I really do. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. God bless you.